Thank you, Natalia. It's wonderful to be back at the Crisis Media Center. Let me say at the top how proud I am of our affiliation with the center, but also how important it is that the center has developed the way it has as a voice for authoritative information, engaging with all of Ukraine and all Ukrainians in multiple languages, because especially at this time, it's particularly important. I thought what I could do, it's been a couple of weeks since I've been here at the center, and so what I thought I could do is offer some quick opening remarks on a few issues on my mind this afternoon, and then take questions in whatever direction would be most useful to everybody. Let me start with a couple of quick remarks about the issues of the day, just to note how truly disgusted I was by the events yesterday in Donetsk. The really brutal attacks, the violent attacks on women and children and elderly people, the folks who had come out in Donetsk to demonstrate in favor of national unity, in favor of a democratic future for Ukraine. I think it's quite telling that so many people were prepared to put it on the line the way they did in yesterday's march, and I think it's quite sad that you had this brutal, violent attack by people who were clearly there with the goal of causing mayhem. Let me also say I'm a couple of minutes late today because I'm coming from a meeting with the OSCE Secretary General, Mr. Zanier, here along with Tim Guldeman, the representative of the OSCE Chairman Office, and we were having another in what has been for the past 2 weeks or so meetings with the Ukrainian government on the implementation of the Geneva framework for de-escalation of the crisis in Ukraine. This has been, for us, a productive channel for engaging on these issues, and in particular to hear from the Ukrainian government the progress that we see in their implementation of the Geneva framework. I was pleased and honored yesterday to join Russian, European colleagues, as well as Foreign Minister Deschitsa, and the mayor, the acting mayor of Kyiv, as we walk through the Kyivska Rada to see the progress that has been made in the renovation of that building, with a big sign in front of it, closed for renovations. We look forward to it being reopened after May 25th with a democratically elected mayor, but clearly in fulfillment of the goal that Geneva sets out for the release of all administrative buildings. We hope very much that armed forces in eastern Ukraine, who we see as qualitatively different, but that those forces will take similar action in the nearest future. We're encouraged by what we see happening in terms of the government's progress on a broad amnesty law, which I understand is being debated in the Rada this afternoon. We also welcome the further progress that the government is making in its development of a framework for constitutional reform, devolution of local authority, greater local responsibility, issues of governance and budgets in particular. All of these steps represent, to our mind, the substantial progress that Kyiv has made in fulfillment of the Geneva objectives. We regret the fact that Russia has not yet been able to exercise pressure to encourage similar action in the East, where obviously the situation continues to deteriorate, including today's reported armed seizure of the administrative building in Luhansk. Maybe two last quick points, and then we can open it up to questions. First of all, as I noted in my opening remarks, I think for the United States right now, and indeed I think for the people of Ukraine, nothing is more important at this moment than national unity. This is a time when the country needs to pull together in the face of an outside threat, in the face of the challenges that have been created. We appreciate the signals that have come from political leaders across the spectrum in support of that objective. I would share one anecdote out of Vice President Biden's visit last week. For me, one of the most encouraging aspects of the visit was his meeting with Rada leaders, where he met with a broad range of political leaders across the spectrum, several presidential candidates, several mayoral candidates. But the one message that every single one of the political leaders enunciated one way or another was the commitment to national unity, the commitment to the idea of Ukrainian territorial integrity, Ukrainian unity, and a Ukraine which moves forward within its current constitutional boundaries. Finally, just to note, we are now, of course, less than 4 weeks out from presidential elections, arguably the most important election in the history of Ukraine. The United States is strongly committed to the success of these elections. I have joined my European counterpart, Ambassador Tymbinski, for several conversations with the Election Commission. The United States, through our Agency for International Development, is supporting the conduct of the elections through our partnership with IFES, the International Federation for Election Systems. We also expect, in addition to the very large observer mission that the OSCE will be deploying and indeed has already deployed here to Ukraine, we will expect large delegations from our political party institutes, from the National Democratic Institute, from the International Republican Institute. I think this is a signal to the Ukrainian people that they will enjoy strong engagement, strong support from the international community, certainly from the United States, as they move towards these critically important elections. For the United States, as I've said before in this setting, the most important thing is that this election be free and fair, that it reflect the will of the Ukrainian people, the choices of the Ukrainian people, and it help to continue the process of recapturing Ukraine's democracy that began on February 21st. So maybe with those opening remarks, let me turn it over to questions, and we can take the conversation in whatever direction would be useful to you.
Sure, great. My colleague Vasil will help. The first question, the third row, please.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, Paul Brennan from Al Jazeera English. Two quick questions. First of all, there seems to be a distinction in emphasis or difference in emphasis between the US sanctions against Russia and the European Union's sanctions against Russia. I wondered whether you feel, from the American point of view, whether the European Union is going far enough. And second of all, in relation to events that are happening in the East, there is grave concern now that the Ukrainian police, we had it in a press briefing just 2 briefings ago, are simply incapable or unwilling to do their job, and the East may simply be slipping away from the administration in Kyiv. What concerns you have in relation to that, please?
Yeah, thanks. Well, on the first question, let me say, obviously, we've coordinated very closely with our European partners throughout this exercise, throughout our engagement in Ukraine. There will be tactical differences. You see that as a manifestation of the different legal frameworks in which and legal systems in which our sanction regimes unfold. But I don't see a great deal of daylight between Brussels and Washington on these questions. In fact, we have the same strategic objective. And I think the United States has been clear that the objective of these sanctions is not sanctions for their own sake, but sanctions to encourage a change in tack from Moscow, to encourage Russia to take the diplomatic off-ramp, to take the diplomatic course that we've tried to chart out. That's certainly a goal that Europe shares. So while I think you may see occasional differences in implementation, the practical approach is, I think, exactly the same at this point and has been carefully coordinated as we've gone forward. On the question of the security situation, let me say a couple of things. Obviously, we are watching developments in the East very closely. We have worked in the past, and we continue to work through our assistance programs with Ukrainian security institutions. We welcome the very prudent approach that the Ukrainian government has taken to managing the security challenges created by the separatism in the East and the outside support for separatism in the East. I think it's worth noting that the government has taken an extremely prudent approach, making clear, for instance, in Slavyansk, that their intention is not to violently clear the city, but to uphold Ukrainian law and to try to cordon the instability as best they can. We continue to work closely with Ukrainian security counterparts in support of that objective, We certainly support the actions that Ukraine is taking to uphold Ukrainian law. I think as concerned as we are about these activities, I think it's worth remembering we're talking about relatively small groups of people, often led by an armed echelon, and I haven't seen the detailed reports yet from Luhansk this afternoon, but if it's followed the usual template, there are guys with guns and balaclavas who are sort of the leading edge, who are then followed by some of these local groups who then set up shop. But this is still relatively isolated. We're talking about small ink blots of instability in an environment where all the polling data suggests that the vast majority of the people of the Donbass, first of all, want to remain as part of an integrated Ukraine and want to see their economic and other concerns addressed through the political system, and certainly not through violence. And then finally, I would just emphasize, as I said in my opening remarks, I see no sympathy at all for the kind of outrageous violence that was inflicted on the peaceful demonstrators in Donetsk yesterday. And I think that says a lot about what we're dealing with at this point. We're dealing with people with knives and baseball bats chasing after and beating elderly people, women, children. There's no place for that. There's no place for that in Ukrainian democracy. Thank you.
I have a question here. Sorry.
Dmitry Shenkaruk, Ukraine National News. Mr. Ambassador, Alexander Turchinov signed the law proclaiming the Crimea the occupied territory. So within 15 days, there should be formed the relevant executive body. Who would be the most suitable candidate for this position, for this minister for Crimea? And what should Ukrainian government do in order to support Ukrainian citizens in the Crimea who are not willing to accept to take this Russian citizenship, and actually how they can feel that the government supports them? Thank you.
No, those are all really good questions, mostly questions to be answered by the Ukrainian government. Obviously, for purposes of the United States, we do not recognize the illegal occupation, annexation of Crimea. We're never going to recognize the annexation of Crimea. So we recognize the requirement under Ukrainian law to find a legal regime to govern issues of taxes and business and the transactions that need to continue. But I think how to shape those policies, those are questions to be determined entirely by the Ukrainian government with no really constructive input that I could provide from the outside. I will say that the United States stands ready to work with Ukraine, to offer Ukraine our legal advice, as I know many other governments have offered as well, as the Ukrainian government begins to develop its legal strategy for dealing with the invasion, the illegal occupation and annexation of Crimea. There are obviously many novel legal issues that are raised in the business sphere, in the sphere of international law, and obviously we stand ready to be helpful to Ukraine to the extent they choose to use the legal mechanisms that they have available to address those issues.
A question here, please.
Международный отдел Рады создан Майдана. Нас интересует ваше мнение о исторической роли Майдана в демократическом сообществе мира. И в частности, ваше смотрение этого вопроса в Америке, в Соединенных Штатах Америки. В Америке. И второй вопрос, что хотел бы я сказать. Сегодня на Майдане будет факельное шествие, провокационное факельное шествие. Просьба, чтобы международное сообщество восприняло как якобы организованное Майданом. Это будет провокационное шествие. Просьба, чтобы все сообщество, мировое сообщество знало об этом. Спасибо.
Yeah. No, well, thank you for the question. And let me say, I think, like many Americans, like many people in the international community, it was hard not to be inspired by what we saw unfold on the Maidan in the 3 months after the 30th of November. I think ultimately, these are issues, again, which belong to the people of Ukraine. And I think in many ways, the question will be the legacy of the Maidan is a question that Ukrainian political leaders will ultimately answer. How does the political system, how does the political establishment live up to the legacy of the heavenly Sotnia, live up to the legacy of those who really, as we say in American English, laid it on the line for their beliefs, for their revolution of dignity. You know, I think the question, you know, clearly now, Ukrainian politics has moved back into democratic structures. You have a presidential election coming up. You have debate underway in the Rada. I think it's entirely appropriate that as those institutional processes have continued, life in the center of Kyiv is returning to normal. I think it's very, very important to find a way to properly memorialize those who sacrificed on the Maidan. I think, like many who live in Kyiv, it was hard not to be deeply impacted by what happened on the 20th of February and the aftermath of that. So I think, you know, again, not to cop out, but these are questions that have to be answered ultimately by political leaders. Clearly, as I've said, it's the time now when the processes need to transition into Ukraine's democratic institutions, and none of those institutional channels is more important than the elections on May 25th. But I think certainly all of us recognize that the Maidan changed something fundamental about Ukraine. And in many ways, this is a different country from the one that I arrived in at the beginning of August. And what it will be shaped as for the future, that's for you and for the people of Ukraine to decide.
Here.
Mr. Ambassador, Rowie Ruttenberg from CCTV News. President Obama was in Asia when these sanctions were announced, and last night China said that imposing sanctions is not helpful in terms of solving the problem. They said it goes against the interests of all parties and effectively accused Washington, said Washington, quote, will only exacerbate the tension. Also in March, they said they warned of the consequences of spiraling sanctions. How do you respond to China's comments last night?
Well, again, I mean, I think I will leave it to Washington to respond to Beijing on these questions. I think we have made clear that for the United States, sanctions are not an end in themselves. They are a tool intended to strengthen our diplomatic toolkit, a tool intended to advance our goal of finding a diplomatic de-escalation to this crisis. We've also been very clear in our view that this is a crisis which has its roots in decisions by Russia. The Russian decision to invade Crimea, the Russian decision to foment instability in the East. And so it's Russia that's going to have to make the decisions to de-escalate. We think, as Secretary Kerry said just this morning in a Wall Street Journal interview, the Ukrainian government has played an exceptionally constructive role in its effort to try to avoid deepening of this crisis. So I think I would certainly take issue with any suggestion that it's the United States which is accelerating this crisis. In our view, it's actually the actions of Russia that have had the effect of exacerbating the crisis, and it's Russia which is going to have to make a decision to de-escalate.
Here, please.
Mr. Ambassador, greetings, Michael Hammerschlag, Yahoo. It looks like the Ukrainian government has a choice of either moving in and moving these people out by force and having a lot of bloodshed and risking the consequences of the Russian threats of invasion, or of doing nothing and seeing, as the guy said, the whole region slip away. I mean, it's not just, it might be just a few areas, but it's a wide area, wide region, and they've taken almost all the government buildings. What kind of reaction would America have to troops moving across the border? And what is America's counsel to this government, you know, in what to do here? Because it doesn't seem like they can just let things go on as they are.
No, well, a couple of questions there. I mean, first of all, Russian troops crossing Ukraine's borders would be a major escalation and would draw an inevitable sharp reaction from the United States. And I think that's understood by everybody. It would be a dramatically unfortunate development, which I think would produce only the most tragic consequences. In terms of the current situation and the sort of simmering violence which you see sort of springing up in one administrative center or another across the Donbass. I think our advice would be to encourage the government to continue on the course that it has been pursuing of seeking a strategy to cordon these cities, to use their security forces and the army if necessary to ensure that weapons, money, instability are not trafficked in and out of these cities, but not to engage in the forceful clearing of these buildings, which, from what I read in the media, many of them have been dramatically hardened with sandbags and heavy weaponry. So I think we see great virtue in the prudent approach that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk's government has pursued, and we hope very much that that approach will yield dividends. But again, our key leverage on this is Geneva. It is the obligation that all of the Geneva signatories, to include Russia, have to encourage the release of illegally occupied government buildings. And clearly that is a problem which has only deepened as we look across eastern Ukraine right now. But we're remained engaged, and I had this exact same conversation this afternoon with Mr. Zanier from the OSCE in their capacity as well. And we welcome the fact that the OSCE is remaining closely engaged, not just on the question of what happens to the Vienna document observers who have been held hostage in Slavyansk, but on the broad range of issues around the de-escalation, the release of buildings, the disarmament of the heavily armed individuals who are in many of these administrative centers now.
We have a question in the first row.
Spilne TV, Andrei Babi. Mr. Ambassador, please give your vision about what can to do Ukrainian government and what must to do any country government against renegade, massive renegade activity we can see in local government and deputy units. What must to do government in short time perspective and long time perspective? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And again, I want to underline these are decisions that the government of Ukraine needs to make. The international community, the United States, cannot make these decisions. We appreciate very much the approach that the Ukrainian government has pursued. And in particular, I think we would endorse the strategy that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has followed of attacking this as both a security problem but also a political problem. We see the outreach to eastern oblasts that the Prime Minister and his team have engaged in as being very important. We welcome the steps that the Prime Minister has taken with this process of constitutional reform intended to address the grievances that people in eastern Ukraine have expressed, intended to identify a formula to deepen democracy, to enhance prospects for economic development. Clearly, there's a security dimension to these issues, and we will never question the Ukrainian government's right and decision to uphold its own laws, including through law enforcement mechanisms. But we also acknowledge and happen to agree with the judgment that the Prime Minister has made, that ultimately, if Ukraine is to insulate itself against the kind of instability that is being fomented from outside, that is coming across with these political tourists, you know, a phrase that nobody heard until 2 months ago, that if Ukraine is to insulate itself against these kind of effects, it will need to continue the process of democratization, deepening democracy, deepening local authority, deepening economic authority at the oblast level in order to give people a sense of ownership, but a sense of ownership as part of a unified Ukraine. And that's the most important principle of all.
Here, please.
German radio, Mr. Ambassador, I would like to ask two questions. Do we have any news about the hostages of OSCE in Slavyansk? And second question, how would you comment the announced withdrawal of Russian troops from the border doing by the Russian Minister of Defense Shoigu this night?
Yeah. On the question of the German and other military hostages, we, of course, condemn this unequivocally. We believe that they should be released without conditions, and I want to underline, without conditions. But I don't have any additional information regarding their current circumstances. On the question of Mr. Shoigu and his conversations, frankly, I don't have confirmation at this point. We've heard statements like this in the past. I hope very much it's true. I know there are a lot of people in Ukraine who hope very much that it's true, but I simply can't offer any further confirmation at this point.
We have time only for 2 more questions, so.
Hello, Australian and New Zealand community. I've just come back from Donetsk, and it's quite bad,
yeah.
As you know. And your statement about Russian troops crossing the border, well, they already have done this, and they are sitting in abandoned farmhouses in the east, because I've seen them, and
yeah.
I'll be getting this evidence for you next week.
Good. I'll look forward to seeing your reports.
Yeah. But the thing is, there's a lot of soldiers I met from Crimea who are now in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And when the US said we'll provide non-military aid, they're looking for ACOGs, Trajecon gun sights, things like this, military compasses.
Right.
Can you provide that to our soldiers in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, well, thank you. It's a fair question. Let me say 2 things. We have ramped up, including around Vice President Biden's trip, our non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine. Our emphasis has been on non-lethal assistance. A significant part of the calculation behind that is that over the short term, there is no immediate solution to the military imbalance between Ukraine and Russia. It takes time to train people, to equip them, to procure material. So it truly is the case that this is a crisis which has to be solved through diplomacy, not through military means. That being said, as I noted at the top, we have already enhanced our non-lethal military assistance. We continue actively to review the Ukrainian requests. We were fortunate to have a large number of members of the American Congress in Kyiv last week, and I think a number of them went back with strong views on these questions. So this is an issue that in our system remains under review, but for now our focus has been on non-lethal categories of military assistance.
Just a final question, please.
As far as
I can tell from the briefcase.
No, that's just by accident. As far as I understood, on this new sanction list of the United States stands CEO Sechin of Rosneft, but not CEO of Gazprom Miller. What's, according to the U.S. administration, the difference between Sechin and Miller?
Yeah, I think, on parsing the sanctions lists, I would really defer to my Washington colleagues, especially Department of Treasury and others who've been involved in building these. But what I would emphasize from here on the ground in Ukraine is two facets. One, I think it's way too early to write off these sanctions as inconsequential. I've seen some commentary, including from some friends in the financial community, saying, oh, it's not enough. But I think if you look at the kind of losses Russian markets have faced over the past weeks, and the reaction of some market insiders to these targeted sanctions, I think it's quite a bit too early to say that these actions are not going to have a significant impact on the calculus of the Russian government. We certainly hope that will be the case. We've also made clear just this morning that this is not the end of the process, that these sanctions are intended to accomplish change in Russian activities, that if we see further escalation, if we see further destabilization, there will be an answer to that. We want that to be an answer developed jointly with our European partners, and as I said earlier, one of the founding principles, one of the guiding principles of our policy in Ukraine is the closest possible partnership with Brussels and with our key European allies, and I think that will remain very much the case. But in terms of sort of parsing the specifics of individuals named as part of the latest tranche, I'll have to defer to Washington and my Treasury colleagues on that.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
Your Excellency Pyatt. Thank you very much. It's great to have you at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
for your
much. Great
time.
to see everybody, and enjoy the beautiful afternoon, and hopefully it'll last through May Day.
Thank you very much.